Hidden in the pages of centuries-old cookbooks are recipes so unique they've been completely erased from modern kitchens. From bizarre flavor combinations to cooking techniques long abandoned, these forgotten dishes from the 1700s will make you wonder, why did they disappear? So we're going to start our ride off with Syllabub, which was actually a pretty light and frothy dessert that made its way from England into America all the way back in colonial times. See, in the midst of those colonies, a lot of word of mouth would spread. Now you get people talking like that, and after a drink or two, somebody gets too loud, and suddenly the whole room's heard about a good Syllabub recipe. Dishes from England would spread all the time back then like that, and this one was actually a dessert with remembering. Heavy cream is downright delicious in most forms, but the reason Syllabub really makes it shine is because of the way local American colony would substitute wine or sherry for hard apple cider. Now, maybe it didn't suit the refined palates of the colonialists back then, but it was definitely a drink that got popular with the crowd. You'd even throw in a lemon or two just to put on the whole show. Eventually, the method spread and people began to make it in their homes too, and Syllabub was something that became a lovely, fruity, boozy, and light dessert. Eel pie is also something that's mostly associated with English cuisine. Many coastal and river-adjacent areas back in the 18th century, when it was still colonial America, had an abundant supply of eels. Luckily enough, the local population was quick to take advantage of nature's bounty. In most of these communities, boiled eel pie was something of a local favorite. It was a practical recipe and a really filling dish, meaning that it got the best of both worlds. So you had something that took barely no ingredients along with all the precious comfort that a good meat pie can offer you. Now, eels maybe aren't somebody's first choice of meat when it comes to picking out their pie fillings, but hey, times were clearly different. Now, see, speaking of ingredients, we do have some things in common. The seasonings back then are pretty much what you'd expect them to be now, meaning that thyme, sage, and parsley have a lot of cultural relevance to us apparently. But hey, it does work with eels if that's what you're wondering. You end up making the most out of all the oiliness of an eel, if you've ever had the pleasure or displeasure of having one. Now, hasty pudding was a staple dish back in those 18th century days, and for a lot of the same reasons as eel pie. See, it was a dish that had simplicity rooted in its core, so it was fundamentally just easy to make. It was something that made the most out of cooking traditions that were really foreign to the land though. They weren't used to cooking things the way they do in England. One of the first choices of grains was pretty American though. It was corn, and it was a lot of it. Sometimes people used oats and wheat, but they would always stick to corn as much as they could. Now the next thing was water and milk, and just a little bit of molasses or honey. So I guess if you really think about it, we've been recycling these ingredients for quite a while now. Either way, you might be wondering how all this makes pudding. Well, the milk and water make this porridge-ish thing, and the cornmeal, along with the molasses, ends up enhancing the texture of that in a pretty sweet way, meaning you get a pretty good treat for 5 minutes of effort. Swill milk cakes were something that were really just born out of tough times. They were the kind of thing people relied on when they were trying their hardest to be economical. These cakes were basically a shining historical example of how resourceful American kitchens have been throughout history, and how resourceful they've continued to be. But hey, let's get to the milk cakes. So the term swill mill basically meant milk that had either been diluted or was generally considered the shorter end of the stick. It was a byproduct in a lot of homes because it was usually like the last bit of milk that was left that had probably been sitting in a non-ideal place for a while. Still, a bit of wheat flour and cornmeal go a long way, and then you have the usual blend of molasses, sugar this time, you get treacles. Now, just a little bit of lard and butter really helped too, but what you'd end up with were these pretty fluffy cakes that were amazing for how simply they were made. Pigeon pie is also something that's pretty popular throughout the culinary landscape of the 18th century. It's something that the people appreciated for its intense, deep, gamey flavors, which, believe it or not, people loved back in the day. Nowadays, that's the kind of thing people usually detest about Mia, right? Smells too weird or strong. Anyway, pigeons were actually better off in that regard, since they apparently had a milder scent despite the flavor. Now, the pigeons here were kind of special They had been red specifically for the purpose of being cooked. So pigeon pie was something of a luxury item a few hundred years ago. Funny how the pecking order shifts so massively. Anyway, lots of recipes had your usual herbal seasonings, but the pastry crust made with butter and lard really worked well. It ended up being a homely pie that just brought the best out of its filling, which, hey, what more can you really ever ask of a pie? What you might find weird is that people actually did put fruits like pecans in there to spruce things up, which I honestly think I could do without entirely. Oyster ice cream is essentially one of those things that happens when you bring over an entirely foreign cooking culture to a land. It was a part of a series of unexpected culinary experiments that ended up happening throughout America back then. Sorry, I probably make it sound like more of a cultural phenomenon than it really was. What I'm referring to was basically cooks exploring ways to do different things with the same old stuff they had been working with after being exposed to the English way of doing things. See, normally you'd toss an oyster in a stew, but this time, the briny liquor was the star of the show. See, oysters make a really specific tasting liquor, and that's something that most cooks take advantage of in their dishes today too. Now, the base of this thing was pretty amazing too, and I know you're wondering how ice cream that's oyster flavored can ever be described with the word amazing, but hear me out. Eggs were basically used to thicken the mixture, so you already had a velvety ice cream, and of course, it is ice cream, so it had to be sweet. Heavy cream, milk and sugar were used for the foundation of the ice cream, and just a bit of sherry. What you got was this really oceanic ice cream that's unlike anything we can find today. Mutton turnip stew was a quintessential meal that was popular throughout America for how good it was at being a one-pot recipe. Back then, it was a pretty common thing for people to rear sheep and live off of the land as best they could, and this stew was a mighty fine way of doing that. You got an incredibly warm dish that was amazing for the winters and the harsh climates of the New World, and it also made you tough and strong, which you really had to be to get through a typical day of labor back then. Now, turnips were one of the most popular things to throw in there, along with onions, carrots, parsnips, and your typical herb suspects. What you got at the end was this really savory stew with an incredible meaty flavor and a thick broth. This was a dish that people grew attached to because of how good it was at setting the vibe right at the dinner table. And turnips were everyone's favorite back then anyway, too. Plus, it might have started the whole one-pot thing. Flummery was basically a dish that was this really soft pudding that was something that local households made just to feel fancy about themselves. You know, the type of thing you make on a Wednesday where you have more time than you know what to do with for once. Now, it was a pretty straightforward dish, which wasn't typical of desserts, or at least that was the public perception back then. That kind of added to the appeal because, like most dishes you'll find here, it was pretty simple and blunt. You had ground oats, corn flour, and some arrowroot, and that last one was really important in setting that gelatinous tone just right for this dish. Then you had milk and water for the base, and warm spices with your usual sweeteners. What you got was this dish that was just as soft as it was sweet, but it was the kind of thing where the flavors were really subtle, but the more you chewed, the more you'd notice them. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, let's just say it packs a sneaky punch. It was a way for people to have an easy dessert back then, and it was something that could really be changed up. Pepper cake was this honest-to-God standout confection among the flummery and the syllabub of the 18th century. See, this was one of those dishes that just up and stole your heart right from the get-go. It was simple, really, the kind of thing that'd get you rolled over crying about how good Mom's cooking used to be. Of course, I could tell you about the spices and all the ways they used the same stuff I've been talking about in the video so far in different ways, but I feel like that wouldn't get the point across. See, this whole thing was a labor of love. You had to beat the hell out of the butter or the lard with the sugar until it was just right. And man, those forearm curl sets at the gym do not paint an accurate picture of the strain I am referring to. Next, you really had to be careful with how you folded in the spices and flour. If you didn't pay your due diligence, you may very well have ended up with a soggy mess, and then your kids wouldn't be happy. Now would they? The cake was something that showed you had someone making something with a lot of love for you. And hey, all those spices counted for something. This baby hit like a truck. You know, Of all the never-ending abundance of interesting do-it-yourself Frankenfoods people came up with throughout history, I think one of the most notable ones in my God-given brain has to be calf's foot jelly. This dish was essentially a complete makeover and the kind you'd pay top dollar for. The reason I use the word makeover is because calf's feet aren't really anyone's idea of a good time. When's the last time you wanted to take a girl out on a date and you thought calf's feet were going to be a good idea? Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm sure the doctors will tell you they're loaded with all sorts of goodies with names like calcium and collagen, whatever those are. But hey, feet are feet, and I like mine, yours, and any calf's at a certifiable distance from my mouth. But hey, people had a way of making things work back then. And a bit of boiling, a bit of creativity with some spices like peppercorns and bay leaves and an incredible amount of straining, you'd end up with something that was actually a pretty damn good jelly. And hey, it meant you weren't wasting anything at all as far as the animal was considered, and that's Jesus-approved behavior. Beaver tail roasts were something that were pretty common in North America back in the day. You see, beavers had become something of a local resident in the waterways back then, and they had become something of a community pillar throughout the land in general. Now, besides the usual dam work and scurrying about, these bastards also made for an incredible roast, and huntsmen weren't really keen on letting critters go back then. They were one of the best things to have if you were a frontiersman, and in that context, what's in your bag might as well be worth more than your money. If you were packing beavers, you had good food. Now, funnily enough, the back end of the little nuts is what people preferred the most. The tail meat was something that people loved for the decadent mix of lean muscle and fat, which, mind you, had to be trimmed pretty carefully so this dish could work. Now, the tails were slow roasted in these open hearths, so you already know this is about to be some real gourmet business. People would enjoy these at celebrations and gatherings or when they just, wanted to start a fire and sit outside with their friends. I mean, the only other time they'd have this was out when they were camping, so. Mugget pies were these really modest pies that were pretty much the size of your hand, hence the word modest. They were a convenient and easy way for people to have portable food, and besides what was in your bag, how easy your stuff weighed to carry mattered a lot too. It was something that made the most out of the meat scraps that would usually be left over and some pretty humble vegetables that you'd find in pretty much everyone's pantry back then. A mix of minced meat and chopped meat like venison, beef trimmings, or mutton were essentially the core of this dish, with onions, carrots, and turnips all playing their part later on. I wasn't lying about the turnips, they were like coffee back then. Now what you got out of mugget pies was Hit's really nice savory pie that had an incredible tenderness to it. I know that's something we pretty much always expect to come with our pies, but this one was special, all right? All that meat baked wonderfully and it was soft down to the very last strand. These pies were a way for people to have easy and quick food that did what they needed it do, keep them strong and going on, whether they were lasting out a long journey or a tough week with no food. Salamagundi might sound like something out of Norse mythology, but it's actually just this really cutesy salad. Salamagundi was a colorful and composed array of ingredients that were honestly a lot better than I am at showcasing what the palate of the 18th century was. They were showcasing the culinary scene back then for what it was, a melting pot of different influences. You had European customs melting in with American ingredients, flavors, and convenience, which really isn't all that different from what was happening just 60 years ago in the 90s. History's funny like that. Anyway, after getting the vegetables together, which was basically just stuff like lettuce, radishes, beets, onions, turnips, again, yes, cucumbers and whatever else you had handy and some cold meats, people would add fresh game or leftover scraps, whatever they happened to have on hand at the moment. Next, the fruits and nuts were thrown in, and the nuts had to be really toasted. Not only did that add to the flavor, but it also helped ensure no seeds were messing with your experience. Now, the idea here is something that I'm sure you can already follow. You want to keep it crunchy here. And hey, it did a pretty amazing job of that. It was a versatile dish that worked perfectly in the harsh summer climates too. Now, this next one's really gonna kick you where the sun doesn't shine. How do you make ice cream out of brown bread? Yet that's exactly what I'm here to talk to you about. So let's get to the bottom of this mystery from a couple hundred years ago. See, this time around, it's not experimentation. It's not a lot of different people coming in with new ideas. It's just raw genius at work. I'm not sure who the first person was to come up with this recipe. I don't think we'll ever know, but man, they were onto something. The brown bread had to be crumbled into the milk before it could be melded into the liquid, and the usual stuff was used to make a custard. Once that was done, you had to let it cool. And once it was just cold enough, you had to churn it until it was just the right consistency. People usually used ice houses to keep it cold enough throughout the whole process, but this whole thing was really some work, and it had a taste like nothing else. Stewed carp and red wine is a pretty good example of colonial adaptation. See, freshwater carp was something that Americans were full of. I mean, they just had the stuff out for free, ready to give and give enough for all comers. The next step, though, was a European classic, which was basically boiling the whole thing in sherry, and you had to really slowly simmer this so it would work. The dish would work because the fish would eventually end up taking on the flavors of the red wine, giving a stew that had the best of both worlds instead of a conflicting mess. Stewed carp in red wine was something that showed how the times back then were reliant on mixing indigenous resources and ingredients with European ways of doing things. Imported luxuries were also added like sherry and different kinds of red wines, and though the stew definitely held its own in the taste department, it was something that took a while to be accepted into the mainstream, mostly because the people just thought it was rich European food. Kind of had a bias against them, didn't they? Pork flapjacks are basically a really nice twist on a colonial pancake. They're basically a lot like a colonial pancake, but except this time, each part of the pig essentially ends up getting used. Resourceful cooks tried to make the best out of pork fat and leftover meat, but they were essentially forced to work only with griddles. Flapjacks were really economical, but they were also a really good meal to have, making them one of the nicest breakfast choices this side of the country. The lard was really the shining element of the dish. It just enhanced the flavor of everything all that much more. Pork flapjacks are basically the pinnacle of how people would make the most innovative and delicious dishes out of the most basic things that they had no idea what to do with, but what they did have was a will, and you know how that saying goes. The dish was versatile. It could be mixed with loads of different kinds of herbs, blends of spices, and a lot more. It was also something that could just last throughout the day as a snack. Rabbit fricassee was essentially one of the most favored dishes among different kinds of homes back in the 18th century. People appreciated it for how tender it was, how nice the game meat was, and how comforting the sauce was. It wasn't a heavy sauce, but it was made just a bit more heavy to suit American palates. See, in European culinary tradition, it's often preferred to make full use of a wild rabbit, and rabbit is seen as both a meal for the everyday and a meal for festivities and celebrations. Now, wild rabbits needed to be cleaned and trussed and butchered, something that French people also got pretty good at doing. But home chefs in America were not equally as adept at. What they were good at was sharing the same passion for boozy food, so just a little bit of white wine, some light vinegar, and chicken broth was pretty much all you needed to give this dish the depth it needed. Throw in some egg yolks on top of that and some herbal seasonings and you have yourself a pretty good meal. Plus, those rabbit pieces aren't just full of flavor or super tender, they're also one of the best sources of protein. Gooseblood pudding was essentially just a massive testament to the entire mentality of not wasting anything. Even the blood wasn't something that went to waste here, as the name says. When you combined it with grains, fats, and different kinds of herbs, you actually got a decent pudding, believe it or not. For those of you with the big bad blood phobia, you might want to fast forward through this part of the video. But either way, the dish was a good way to sustain yourself, and the fresh blood was a wonderful binding agent. People added suet too, which was really making it overboard flavor-wise for some people but was just enough for others apparently. This was something that was basically the rawest form of Native American practices blending in with European tradition, and people basically saw this as a refinement on what they had been used to. It's like this. If you show a dog a new trick, he'll be that much more excited to learn it, don't you think? Goose pudding is a vivid example of colonial creativity, and these dishes show you the kind of lifestyles that thrived in the New World. Goose blood pudding was a dish that took an ingredient nobody ever thought anything of into a dish that was actually seen as refined European dining. Who would have thought, right? In terms of flavor, Posset was really creamy and rich, but it had just a little bit of a tang to it. In terms of social optics, it was a pretty good drink, especially when the temperature would drop more than what you were comfortable with. Throughout history, it's a curious little dish that's taken on many twists and turns to end up to where it is now in the books. Posset used to be a drink, but it evolved into boozy custards, thickeners, and what we, with a lot of love, know today as eggnog. It's pretty much the predecessor to the whole dish. So the next time you're sipping on the nog during Christmas, thinking about who the genius was that came up with the idea for it, well, now you know. Still, I'm glad they changed the name on this because Posset just doesn't roll off of the tongue the same way as eggnog. Posset was essentially just a really warm drink with medicinal properties too. It was heated milk and cream in a pot and with a little bit of sherry or brandy stirred in to help curdle the milk. It wasn't a lot, and it didn't take an expert chef to make. You just needed to have booze you were happy with and some pretty good cream for the full effect. Now, hardtack was really just what you would consider to be the total thematic, tonal, and culinary opposite of Posset. Kind of like the way red is for blue, the way Batman is for Superman. It was a dish that was essentially built to last as long as it possibly could, and it was often something that people used for lots of military rations and travels. Long journeys with few stops in between? Yeah, hardtack was going to keep you at least a decent bit away from the edge of a bad hunger pang. It didn't even take anything, just flour, water, and sometimes a little bit of salt. All you had to do was have a roller and be semi-good with a knife so you could cut the shapes. And that's not really that much of an ask from anyone, is it? Let's talk about the biscuit itself, though. While Posset went on to inspire one of the most iconic drinks throughout all of American history, not just the 18th century, hardtack was dry, dense, and extremely flavorless, and essentially is only remembered as something people ate during tough times and when they had nothing else to substitute for it. It had a bit of a nutty taste from the flour, but really, that was it. A deep dive into the world of baked hedgehogs will reveal that they were not actually made from hedgehogs. Instead, they were really just an almond dessert. You know, the same way you can paint a white canvas with 10 different shades of white and call it Rabbit in a Snowstorm or something. People will use anything as long as they think it works. Popular and wealthy homes were basically the ones where you would see this dish the most often. And in wealthy households, elaborate, extravagant, and very exaggerated presentation was often the main attraction. Instead of, the food. Anyway, you can't say that about this one because these blanched almonds, once grounded into a fine paste and mixed with some eggs, sugar, and butter, make the perfect base. People used to throw in rose water or orange blossom water in there too, just to give it a bit more of a floral touch, and it would actually end up working. The scent of aromatics, warm spices, flowery waters, and golden hues made this dish stand out at any table it was presented on. Despite being named after hedgehogs, it's a lot closer to royalty than they ever will be. It's a dish that was really just preserved for the wealthy back then, as you can probably tell by all the showboating. An ale flip was essentially a supremely hot and frothy drink that was made entirely of ale, rum, eggs, and spices. It was a really popular drink to order in taverns, and people had this incredibly funny tradition of sticking the hot end of a poker into the drink. No, really, they did that. And they said it helped make it sweeter and gave it a sizzle. Me? I think they just liked the theatrics, and all flavor-related changes were probably placebo, but hey, if you can explain the science behind poker-based cooking, please do. It was a beverage that's really just very working class, and it's something that mixes different kinds of booze together to give you what you want. Rum or brandy help to make it a stronger drink, but eggs and molasses help give it thickness and sweetness. The ale was already heated before it was poked by, well, the poker. This was one of those drinks you would get when you were out in the city with your friends just for the purpose of getting absolutely plastered. Plus, the poker thing really knew how to get a crowd in the mood for some reason. Black pudding is basically just blood sausage, and I know you've all probably had more than your fair share of blood-related cooking for today, but humor me just one more time. It was something that was made from fat, grains, and fresh animal pudding, which essentially made for a fully savory experience, but this was something that was met with a lot of divisiveness. It had European rotos, deep ones, So that meant it was already off to a bad start in those times. It was also something that used pig and cattle blood that had been left over from slaughtering, but a lot of people thought it was honestly just too barbaric. I mean, people had barely gotten used to their food and stuff like offal, let alone this. See, the method is equally as gross. You collect all the leftover blood that's literally just there from butchering, by the way, so people would just collect it as they went about their business. You'd stir it constantly so it wouldn't coagulate, and it was a mixture of different kinds of casings, which were usually intestines being poured into these cloth molds before being boiled. I know this really doesn't paint a pretty picture, but it wasn't supposed to, either. It was just a way for people to stretch their pantries, not waste anything, and make sure they were getting the most out of their food. Still though, wow, the difference in time periods is amazing. I think most people would low-key freak out if you served them this. Now see, venison pasties were the perfect example of a savory pie done right. This here was your average run-of-the-mill portable meat pie until somebody had the fantastic idea to import it over to America, where hunters more or less fell in love with the thing. It relied on deer meat, so go figure. It was something that we got from British Cornish traditions, and pasties were originally meant for miners, laborers, and different kinds of workers who spent their entire day in factories and shit. In America, venison pasties were essentially just common in these makeshift or sometimes genuine hunting communities and frontier settlements, which really could have been anything from a couple of walls and a crowd to a whole full-blown settlement. Either way, venison pasties were mixed in with beef sweat, onions, leeks, root vegetables, and lots of seasonings to make a very flavorful pie, and it did an amazing job of mixing everything together. Of course, the final touch was just a little bit of broth or booze in the form of ale, but don't tell anyone I told you that, so that the flavors could really come together. But man, deers used to be abundant back then. I mean, the things were like frogs in a river. You couldn't really escape them, meaning huntsmen and trappers had a lot of chances to try and refine this recipe. Huntsmen in different areas started having regional preferences, like some would throw some bacon on there, some would even eat it cold. But either way, the recipe got nationally known. Spotted dog pudding was basically just steamed or boiled sweet pudding, and before you ask why they call it spotted dog, let me explain, okay? It's a funny little tale. Anyway, this rustic dish was the go-to lunch for settlers, laborers, and just about everyone who was spending their day and meals outside while they are away at work. Now, to the name. See, they call this spotted dog pudding because it uses a lot of raisins and currants, right? When you mix that in with the pale white dough, well, you get kind of a Dalmatian situation going on. The pudding was something that inherited British and Irish customs, both cultures having lots of room for boiled puddings in their history. They were really popular among colonists, which is what made them popular in colonial America. You could expect a really rich and nutty flavor with occasional bursts of sweetness from all the raisins and currants. Some people really digged the glucose rush and wanted to add in just a little bit of molasses or syrup so that the dish would give off a sweeter flavor. Spotted dog was a laborer's food through and through, and it got a lot of people through a lot of painful and hard days at work. It was also a dish you would see at taverns, so it was like the 18th century's equivalent to having roadside tavern food back then. Plus, before bread puddings, fruitcakes, and American dumplings could take over, this was one of the top dogs as far as American dessert options were considered, and I think we could all do considerably worse than this, right? Before chicken became everyone's favorite pie stuffing, rabbit pie was a favorite on the Easter table. Made out of tender rabbit meal, this savory pie was a household favorite in many rural areas. Rabbit meat is not only rich in flavor, but it's full of nutrients, which made this a healthy choice for many and a staple of the American pioneers. Plus, rabbit meat didn't cost a fortune like most meat back in the day and was widely available. Along with rabbit meat, ingredients of the filling of a rabbit pie typically included onions, celery, and carrots. Some English variations included prunes, bacon, and cider, while the Australians sometimes included the food paste Vegemite. Rabbits aren't as common as they were back then, so rabbit pie has vanished from our tables and Easter traditions. You know what, all good things come to an end. Speaking of the chefs of today, they have some pretty interesting differences when it comes to the modern take on a mincemeat pie. These days you see dried fruits and even rum and brandy being used in the dish along with various spices. No sign of meat anywhere, despite it literally being in the name. In the past, mutton or ground beef and raisins, nuts, pecans, seasonal dry fruits like these were all you needed to make an exceptionally lovely mincemeat pie. This pie has always been typically served at Christmas, but it took off so well in the South that many families would just have it as a weekly dinner too. Do you have any memories of a mincemeat pie from your childhood days? What kind of differences can you note between the pies of then and now? We sure see a lot of differences. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma loved that. There are some baking challenges that only your grandmother is equipped for, and making the pinnacle of brown butter sweet potato pies was one of them. Seriously, even bakeries and fancy eateries have struggled to nail every aspect of a pie, but for most home chefs in the United States, it seems to be just another Tuesday with the oven. You take a flaky pie crust with a velvety potato filling that is usually topped off with whipped cream, but most older cooks preferred maple syrup as that was what they grew up with. Just a bit of dark brown sugar would elevate this dish into the perfect dessert, though it would often steal the show entirely on its own. The thing is built to make your mouth water, and we mean looks-wise too, since the brown and caramel hues of the pie just make it all the more enticing. Have you ever heard of this one before, and would you try it? If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, this one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. A favorite of not just grannies across the nation, but also George Clooney. Transparent pie raises an eyebrow because you hear the name and get curious, and that is why you come to the dish, but people always stay for the killer flavor. Nobody knows where the first transparent pie really originated from, but it has been popular in the South and Midwest in places like Mason County in northern Kentucky. It used the same ingredients as a water pie, but without the water, resulting in a richer, denser texture. Before you start wondering, no, the pie is not actually transparent. It probably got its name due to the heavy usage of vanilla that gives the pie its iconic essence. Or maybe our grandparents just went too overboard trying to make sure our sweet teeth were catered to. While the southern states were enjoying Tex-Mex cuisine, the northern states were all about Italian flavors, and baked ziti was a staple on the dinner table. Now, even with its Italian roots, you wouldn't typically find this one in Italy. This casserole was created by grandmas who were Italian immigrants to the States and adapted traditional pasta dishes to suit the ingredients available in their new country. Baked ziti was pretty much the long-lost cousin of lasagna, with the classic version including ziti pasta, marinara sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese. The ziti pasta used in the dish was tubular and smooth, which makes it ideal for holding onto the sauce and cheese. This one was a hit at Sunday dinners and had everyone coming back for seconds. Pot roasts have been as much a part of the grand scheme of American culture and cuisine as anything else on this dish, and each area, state, and neighborhood has their own ideas of what one should look like. Were you the kind of kid that grew up on beef chuck roast, potatoes, a beefy broth, and carrots in your roast? Maybe you had boneless chuck roast, olive oil, bay leaves, and stuff like that instead. These are just the few variations you can expect to find when it comes to a good, well-done pot roast. The perfect party snack or a great one to pull out for an incredibly large family dinner with the in-laws and extended family, this is one dish that never fails to pull through, especially when a seasoned cook is behind it. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak, and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. We all love a good chiffon pie cake, and grandmas are known to get pretty busy with them, especially if it is for a special occasion. We are not sure if Halloween comes into that for you, but for many kids in the late 1900s to 2000s, you could not celebrate October's finest activity without pumpkin chiffon pie. Made with a custard filling that used pumpkin and mixed with egg whites beaten to sheer, creamy perfection, gave the pie a fluffy meringue-like texture that really did justice to the chiffon genre of desserts. Plus, the granulated sugar brought out the best within the pumpkin. Grandmas all around had perfected the art of making sure the gelatin mixed as well as it could with the egg whites, and that is what made their pies so incredibly airy and weightless. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. Beef stew is a nostalgic childhood dish nobody can go without. Fresh pearl onions and a broth made out of the beef stock were the tricks to an unbeatable stew that is sorely missed every time you eat one that is not your grandma's. The modern-day beef stew involves an entire list of 10 ingredients for better readability that feels more like an overdone broth mixed with a lot of toppings. But that is because beef stews have gone a bit out of fashion unless you are in the South. This is also because beef stews today are usually made with red wine as a base. But the hearty and vigor-filled ones of your childhood were all about keeping it simple with vegetables and a solid cut of beef. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. But hey, if you're ever feeling adventurous enough, I say give this one a try. Vegetable pie recipes go all the way back to Europe, but this is about America, so let's stick to the Cliff Notes version of our history tour. Sweet potato pie actually got very popular in the southern parts of the USA during the colonial era, when America was still a colony under the British Empire. Sweet potatoes had always been used by southern folk in their desserts. Initially, the vegetable was popularized by Black American households that spread their magic across the nation. It gets more interesting, though, as word is they got the idea from Native American cooking practices. Basically, the rabbit hole of who made it first can go deep, but none of that matters when you consider how cost-effective and delicious this pie is. Potatoes in general were becoming the top most consumed vegetable, and to find a way to incorporate it into a dessert for the masses is cooking talent at its finest. Remember when Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and canned tuna were the stars of the food aisle back in the day? Well, Grandma took those humble ingredients and spun them into her classic tuna noodle casserole. During the 1950s and 1960s, convenience foods were all the rage, and tuna noodle casserole fit the bill perfectly. It was a post-World War II creation and was whipped up in no time with ingredients already on hand. Plus, it was a classic comfort food that brought everyone together at Graham's dinner table. During the mid-20th century, tuna noodle casserole was a mainstay in American cookbooks and cooking magazines. It was often featured in advertisements and was promoted as a quick and easy dish for the busy homemaker. This one fell out of flavor, but thanks to the recent revival of noodle dishes, we might see this one back on the menus soon. In the meantime, why not dust off Grandma's old cookbooks and bring it back yourself? Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually, biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. Custard pies refer to uncooked custard mixtures that are put in a cooked crust and then baked together, and they were a pretty big hit in North America. Of course, you have the usual criminals when it comes to ingredients, such as vanilla extract and granulated sugar, but interestingly enough, many housewives opted for a dash of nutmeg too. Do not mix this up with cream pies as that uses cooked custard, and many pro-home bakers would make the perfect custard pie by making the most out of how eggs work as great bindings. Also, if you remember buttermilk pies from just a while ago, then it is also another kind of custard pie. Popular spins on the dish would see almonds being used or turning it into a bean or potato pie, but those are all. Tamales are a labor of love, but thanks to Grandma, this tamale pie was a much easier way to enjoy the flavors. This casserole caught on like fire in the early 20th century, particularly in the Southwest, where Mexican influence was strong. Just like most casseroles on the list, this one-dish wonder was also a creation of the Depression era. Some versions of this pie started out as a way to use up leftovers, such as bits of meat, vegetables, and even leftover chili. But hey, no one complained because the end result was a delicious dinner. Many families have an heirloom recipe for this casserole passed down from generation to generation. So if this casserole brings back memories from your childhood, it might be time to give Grandma a call. She could be holding on to a secret recipe that she's finally ready to pass down to you. Now, mashed potatoes and gravy need no introduction or explanation. Everyone and their mother's mother has had it. But did you know how good they were at making it? Receiving this dish from the chefs of generations ago was an entirely different experience in comfort. We do not know what spices they would mix, as each area had its own variations, with some even using mushrooms. Most popular was coriander, thyme, black pepper, and some oregano. The gravy would even put KFC to shame, if we are being completely honest. You just did not feel like eating from the outside when you had such fine dining available at home, and it was the perfect thing to get you back up only our feet from an exhausting day. If you think the beef heart is off limits for cuisine, you're wrong, because stuffed hearts were once a celebrated dish. This dish sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was actually quite common. Think of the beef heart cleaned, stuffed with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and often pine nuts or raisins, and then roasted or braised. Sounds appetizing yet? This economical and tasty meal was a testament to the nose-to-tail philosophy of cooking, where no part of the animal was wasted. In Europe, the practice of stuffing animal hearts dates back to medieval times. It was a popular dish amongst the working class in England, while it was reserved for the elite in France. Eating hearts isn't as common today, but if you ever tried this one, you'd understand the hype. Extremely popular in states like Oregon was the purple plum pie, which sounds as appetizing as it actually is. People would use branded canned purple plums or homegrown ones and layer black plum slices to give an incredibly deep purple color, along with a very vivid texture. Think of it like a tart cherry pie that you could really sink your teeth into, where the food just seems to melt perfectly in your mouth. In terms of syrup, most people thought to keep it plain and simple with just a good and proper lavender syrup because it really brought out the vanilla extract in the pie. Plum pies were always a big hit in America, but this dish took it a step further and solidified them as one of the many gems of the 1900s. The fact that it literally looks like a gem if you get a bit creative with the layering does not help at all. Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know Gram used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before, so this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese? Here is a dish that you have probably heard of one too many times but never gotten enough of: meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Let's just say that comfort cooking really does not get much higher than this, nor more relaxing. Sitcoms, movies, and comedies across the decades that depict middle-class families always have somebody serving up a killer meatloaf, and it is for good reason. Our generation's parents always grew up eating a hearty meatloaf with a side of perfectly mushy soft potatoes, so it is no wonder that they kept the custom going. Today, mashed potatoes have an 85% popularity rate, which even beats hamburgers and cheeseburgers. You would think that those would be America's top one, but it seems nothing can beat Gran's meatloaf classics. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. Buttermilk coconut pies were usually 9-inch pie crusts filled with this rich, thick buttermilk custard that had these tropical notes of coconut accompanying it. Most people in the 1900s had this locked down and would regularly make it, passing the recipe on to their kids so that they could make it for their children one day. You cannot teach your grandmother to suck eggs, though, and neither can you teach her how to make a better coconut pie. Whether it was the amount of buttermilk, the flaky but crumbly crust, or the custard filling that lured you into an incredibly peaceful food coma is beyond us. Buttermilk coconut pies had it all, though, and no one knew what the secret was. Was it how they beat the eggs to perfection, or the small window of a few seconds between perfectly golden brown and overdone? Either way, making one of these was like a Tuesday afternoon reflex to many grannies. So, squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Gram's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Gram could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Southern skillet cornbread has been a beloved memento of the South for many decades to the rest of the nation, but in the area, it is a tradition that goes back all the way to the 18th century. History books tell us that it comes from Native American cuisine, and it makes sense since a lot of Native American cuisine was very cost-effective. It is kind of everything you would want in a home-cooked meal, easy on the wallet, simple ingredients you can find at any nearby store, and little prep time, which means you can get your cravings fulfilled immediately. Plus, most cooks back then were so accustomed to it from a lifetime of making cornbread in these cast iron skillets that they could make it much faster than even an experienced cook. Guess experience counts for something, especially when you have 40 to 50 years of it, right? Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. Let's take it up a notch with some fancy pies instead of basic ones, and the cranberry chiffon pie does not disappoint by any means. Like a dish torn right out of a baking simulation game, with cranberry juice, oranges, egg whites, and more, this pie looks just a little better than it tastes. If the taste is a 10 out of 10, then we are dealing with a 10.5 in terms of appearance. Some things just go past your expectations, do they not? This was a pie you could find both in bakeries and in the homes of your family as you would visit, but there was nothing like a fresh chiffon pie right out of Grandma's oven. Green bean casserole started out as a traditional Thanksgiving meal, but because of how much everyone loved it, it soon became a year-round delicacy. This one was also created as a creative way to market Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. When canned soups first hit the food aisle at grocery stores, many people were skeptical about them. Introducing new recipes was a way of encouraging people to add them to their daily meals, and Grandma really followed through with this one. The original recipe, known as the green bean bake, was developed by Dorcas Riley, a home economist at Campbell's. It combined green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and fried onions, and it was published in the company's recipe booklet. Our sweet old grandmas decided to make this one better by adding their own twists to the original recipe. Although traditionally rich and creamy, There were lighter versions of green bean casserole that used lower fat ingredients or alternative toppings to make it healthier. If you ever found yourself wondering what people did to celebrate fall back in the days of your grandparents, then wonder no longer, because we have the answer. Dishes like butternut squash mac and cheese fulfilled that craving of comfort food that the fall season tends to bring, while also being new and fresh enough to keep things interesting. Mac and cheese is already known for being pretty creamy texture-wise, but the squash just takes that and amplifies it tenfold. Also, it sneaks in some sweetness in there too, which really brings the entire dish full circle. This dish is a favorite of people who are in their 40s or 50s, and they would always go overboard with the squash. The difference in this dish is that it does not require you to make a roux with flour and butter and uses pureed roasted squash as the base for the cheese sauce. It actually works a lot better than regular mac and cheese. One blessed thing about the hand of a passionate grandparent cooking for their favorite family members is that they always knew how to get the best out of the bland and boring. Things like apples were suddenly key players in cultural delicacies like apple cider vinegar pie, when before, parents would struggle to get their kids to even maintain eye contact with an apple for more than 10 seconds. Granted, these were sautéed apples with vinegar, vanilla, cinnamon, and a lot of time in the oven, but they were still irresistible. A good cinnamon or maple syrup was the perfect sauce to round this pie off and bring its full potential as an acidic but sweet slice of heaven out. Apple cider vinegar has been a popular hit in America for many decades now, and it does not look like the grandparents of today intend to change that. This next one remains a favorite at the holiday dinner table. I'm talking about the cheesy hash brown casserole. This dish is also known as funeral potatoes because it is commonly served as a side dish during traditional after-funeral dinners. However, it is also popular at potlucks and other social gatherings, sometimes under different names. The dish usually consists of hash browns or cubed potatoes, cheese, onions, cream soup or a cream sauce, sour cream, and a topping of butter with cornflakes or crushed potato chips. It typically uses frozen hash browns, which makes the preparation quick and easy. While it was often served as a side dish, cheesy hash brown casserole was also enjoyed for breakfast or brunch. Now, that's a breakfast I'd never skip. Moreover, this dinner meal is so famous that during the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, one of the souvenir food pins featured this casserole. A recipe that is largely forgotten right now but still made some noise back when it was really popular in the 20th century is shrimp and grits. The secret to an incredible plate of these was all in the milk, butter, and cheddar cheese. Depending on the quality and how you handled it, you would ever have shrimp that had not really absorbed the flavor or the best seafood experience you could hope to have at home. Luckily, over many long years, the home cooks of our nation perfected the recipe and kept passing it down, one generation to the next. Some chopped bacon for a smoky flavor, or sausage drippings were also really popular picks for older chefs to run with. Grits would be made with dent corn and often boiled, then mixed with the butter and milk. How did your family make these, if they ever did? A lot of our grandparents had to go through one of the most haunting patches of history, the Great Depression, and they had to whip up entirely new cooking ideas to get by. One of these was the water pie, which created a buttery pie with the main ingredient being its namesake, literally just water. So actual ingredients for pies became so incredibly difficult to get, and people had to go weeks without what was once easily available comfort food. That was just the best case scenario, and the likely case was that people would not taste the pies of their childhood for a very long time. However, a lot of chefs came to the rescue of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties everywhere with the water pie. Just some water, sugar, and butter plus cinnamon and a store-bought crust was enough for this. Flaky buttermilk biscuits are all well and good if you buy them as a snack at your local mart, but you have not tried a buttermilk biscuit until you get a veteran baker to make these for you. Who better than family? And what family member is more skilled in baking than your trusty grandmother? Well, not all of them cook or bake, but the nation has more than its fair share of grandma's creamy buttermilk recipes floating around the internet and cookbooks from dozens of years ago. Practice always makes perfect, and most home chefs learned that the great secret of an impeccable buttermilk biscuit is to not overmix so that you avoid flat and tough biscuits. These were extremely common as snacks to give to children in the family during holidays and were the perfect pairing for a gift basket. Speaking of buttery pies, let's talk about the grapefruit meringue pie, which was one of the propellers of meringue pies in America, and your grandparents played no small part in that. Citrusy, creamy, and sour but fruity, this pie had an incredibly diverse range of flavors, giving it an edge over other pies in the game. It stood out for all the right reasons, and the aroma called to you every time, especially if it was coming from your grandmother's house as you got out of the car. Golden brown, tart lemon layers with the sweetest, thickest meringue you could imagine on top, and some fresh grapefruits right from the market was about as good as being a kid could get in the 20th century. Now, how's that for a blast to the past? Comment which food you found the most interesting down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.